A former soldier who lost his hearing in a conflict. As he works to rebuild his life, he becomes the closest protector of a prominent politician. But danger doesn't always come from the outside. In this story, where mystery, courage, and loyalty collide, the revelation of secrets will change everything. How far can one person go? Stay tuned to find out. David found himself in a completely different life after leaving the army. He had lost most of his hearing in a conflict and had started using a hearing aid. Being forced to leave the army had left him not only physically but also emotionally scarred. On top of that, David was going through a divorce, trying to stay strong for his 2 children, but it wasn't easy. The government had assigned him a desk job, but this was far from the lifestyle David was used to. He had always preferred being in the field, living an active life, and now, sitting at a desk and dealing with paperwork made him feel isolated and incomplete. One day on his day off, he decided to take his kids to their grandmother's farm. It was their favorite place, and David was eager to see the happiness on their faces. The farm, located near the city, was right by the train tracks. The kids loved watching the passing trains and playing with the farm animals. But for David, things weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Deep down, he was struggling with a sense of despair, feeling like he had lost control of his life. He was only 35, but the past few years had weighed heavily on his shoulders. Even though he managed to put on a smile while spending time with his kids on the farm, a storm was raging inside him. This visit offered him a chance to bond with his children and a brief escape from the chaos in his life. While walking on the snow, David was on the phone with an old army buddy. Thanks to his hearing aid, he could hear the conversation clearly, but it had grown so deep that he stopped noticing what was happening around him. A light breeze brushed his face, and he could feel the crunch of ice under his feet as they pressed into the snow. While listening to his friend, his eyes wandered to the large farm across the train tracks. The white fences, snow-covered fields, and distant barns completed the serene view. At that moment, something moved in the corner of his eye. At first, he couldn't make out what it was, but when he focused, he saw a child heading toward the train tracks. The child was holding a toy and seemed to be playing joyfully in the snow. But when the child stopped and sat down on the rails, David's instincts kicked in. "Hey, get off there," he shouted. But the sound of the approaching train easily drowned out his voice. The little boy seemed completely unaware of the danger around him. David forgot about the call, shoved the phone into his pocket, and started sprinting toward the child. Running on the snowy ground was difficult. His feet slipped on the ice with every step, and his breath turned into visible vapor in the cold air. Meanwhile, the sound of the train grew louder. When David saw that the boy was still on the tracks, he pushed himself to run even faster. Across the tracks, he noticed 2 men in black suits also running toward the child. But they were too far away, and it was clear they wouldn't make it in time. "Hey, get up!" David shouted again, but the train's noise was deafening now. The boy sat in the middle of the tracks, completely absorbed in playing with his toy truck. David, breathing heavily, was just a few meters away when the train's headlights fully illuminated them. Time seemed to slow down. With one final push, David lunged toward the boy, grabbing him with one arm and throwing him as hard as he could off the tracks. At the same time, he rolled into the snow himself. The train thundered past them at incredible speed. Snow was thrown into the air by the gust of wind, and the deafening noise filled the area. David lay on the ground, struggling to catch his breath, jolted by the sound of the boy crying. The child, clutching his toy tightly, had no idea what had just happened and burst into tears. By then, the men in black suits had reached them, running from the other side of the tracks. One of them immediately picked up the boy, trying to calm him down. The other bent down and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "My God, you did an amazing job. That was so close," he said, but his voice trailed off. David, still shaken by the event, slowly got up and looked at the men's faces. His eyes darted to the child, who was still clutching the toy truck tightly, and then to the train. A few seconds later, and the rescue might not have been possible. "You're okay, right?" one of the men asked. David nodded. "Come with us," the other said. "Let's get you inside and warm you up with something hot." As David brushed the snow off his trembling hands, he tried to process what had just happened. He had just lived through the most critical seconds of his life, unaware that this moment was the beginning of a much bigger story. When David stepped onto the wide porch of the farmhouse with the 2 bodyguards, a woman rushed out in a hurry. She had an air of elegance and charm, and the moment she saw the little girl, she ran toward them, shouting in panic, "Amanda!" She took the girl from the bodyguard's arms and held her tightly, tears streaming down her face. As she tried to calm her daughter, she turned to the bodyguards and demanded in a sharp tone, "How could you let this happen? How did she get out of the farmhouse without you noticing? The bodyguards lowered their heads in silence, unable to respond as her frustration mounted. Meanwhile, David began to look around. Paying little attention to the heated conversation, his eyes landed on the fence surrounding the farm. Under the snow, he noticed a small gap that caught his eye. Politely interrupting, he said, "This happens often. I think a dog may have dug under the fence. The child probably got out through there." The woman paused, looking at the spot David pointed out. Her face turned pale with a mix of fear and realization. "That's possible," she said, then immediately turned to the bodyguards, ordering, "Check all the fences and find someone to fix this immediately." She then turned to David, holding her daughter even closer. Taking a deep breath, she asked with gratitude in her voice, "Did you save her?" David replied calmly, "I was just in the right place at the right time." The woman nodded, her expression softening with relief and gratitude. She handed her daughter back to one of the bodyguards and said, "I will never forget what you've done." Taking a deep breath, she introduced herself. "I'm Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "Please let me offer you some tea. I'd like to thank you properly." David inclined his head slightly and replied, "Thank you for your kind offer, but I came here with my kids. My time with them is limited, so I'll need to decline." The woman smiled faintly. "Of course, enjoy your time with your children. But please know I'm deeply grateful," she said. As David walked away from the porch, his eyes lingered briefly on the fence and the grandeur of the farm. He didn't know who the woman was, but the encounter had left a mark on him. On his way back to his grandmother's farm, he couldn't stop thinking about the events and the strange meeting he had just experienced. When David arrived at his mother's farmhouse, the silence inside was palpable. Stepping in quietly, he found his two children sprawled across the large couch in the living room, fast asleep. Their small faces bore peaceful expressions. For a moment, David stood there taking in the scene, and the turmoil inside him subsided briefly, replaced by a sense of calm. He sat down beside them, drawing comfort from their warmth, and closed his eyes. For a short while he drifted into a deep sleep, free from the world's troubles. When he woke up, his phone was buzzing with nearly 100 notifications. Rubbing his eyes, he picked it up and tried to make sense of the sudden influx. Among the messages, a video link caught his attention. Clicking on it nervously, he was taken to a video that made his breath catch. The video, recorded from one of the nearby farms, captured every second of David's rescue of the child from the train tracks. It showed his desperate sprint, the train speeding past them, and the moment he saved the child. The footage was shockingly clear. But what truly stunned him was the fact that this video had already gone viral, with millions of views and coverage by major news outlets. A bold headline accompanied the video: "Famous politician Margaret Bell's child saved by former soldier." David's mind was reeling. Who had filmed this? Judging by the angle, whoever recorded it had been close enough for David to have noticed, yet in the chaos, he hadn't. Someone from a neighboring farm must have witnessed the entire event. But the most startling part was the name in the headline: Margaret Bell. Margaret Bell was one of the country's most well-known politicians, frequently appearing in the media. David had seen her on television before, delivering speeches or giving interviews, but he hadn't realized that the woman he met at the farm was her. Now things were more complicated. The video's rapid spread and its appearance on news platforms weren't just because of Margaret Bell's prominence, it was also likely due to David's own past. During his time in the military, David had earned recognition for a major achievement, which had briefly brought him into the spotlight. Reporters might have remembered his face, but this situation felt more personal. David set his phone down on the table and buried his face in his hands. What was he supposed to do now? He had no idea how this event would shape his life, but one thing was clear: it was completely out of his control. After quickly packing his children's bags, David boarded the first train heading back to the city with them. On the train, he noticed people glancing at him while whispering among themselves, some even openly pointing in his direction. This kind of attention was something David had always disliked. He preferred quiet and anonymity. Pulling his hood over his head, he tried to blend in, silently telling himself, "This will blow over." When they arrived in the city, David dropped his kids off with their mother. As he said goodbye, he reassured them they'd see each other again soon. Once he returned home, he decided to check social media to gauge the extent of the situation. What he found left him with mixed emotions. Some of the comments were overwhelmingly positive. People praised David's bravery, hailing him as a hero. However, the remarks about Margaret Bell were polarizing. While some supported her, others were harshly critical. Comments like, She can't even manage to keep her child safe with all her staff and bodyguards. She's unfit for office," were particularly scathing. David didn't share Margaret's political views, but seeing a mother subjected to such harsh criticism felt unfair to him. After all, it had been an accident and nobody could lead a flawless life. With a deep sigh, he decided to put his thoughts aside and get some rest. The next morning, David returned to his desk job, which he loathed. While working, something unexpected happened. His supervisor called him into the office. Entering the room, David felt a wave of unease, but the supervisor greeted him with a smile. "David, I know this job isn't your favorite. You have an impressive military background and this desk work isn't really your thing. But I've always been glad to have you here," he said. Caught off guard, David responded, "Thank you, sir," the supervisor continued. "I got a call from the Ministry of Internal Affairs this morning. They requested information about you, specifically regarding the Margaret Bell incident. When I asked why, they only said it was for an inquiry." David, puzzled, asked, "Should I be worried, sir?" The supervisor replied calmly, "On the contrary, this might be a good thing for you. Seems they have plans for you. If I hear more, I'll let you know." Returning to his desk, David tried to focus on his work, but his mind raced with questions. A few hours later, the supervisor called him back into the office, this time with important news. "David, I just received a formal request from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They want to offer you a position as Margaret Bell's head of security. Security teams for politicians aren't made up of just anyone, they usually consist of former soldiers or highly trained personnel like you." David was stunned. The offer was both surprising and overwhelming. 4 years he'd been trying to piece his life back together, and now he was faced with an opportunity that could change everything. "I didn't see this coming," he said, his eyes wide with disbelief. When David started his new job as the head of security, he found a sense of purpose and direction that he hadn't felt in a long time. His field experience and sharp instincts allowed him to quickly identify and address gaps in Margaret's security team. While taking his duties seriously, David also had the chance to get to know Margaret on a deeper level. He soon realized that the image of Margaret portrayed in the media was far from the truth. Contrary to efforts to paint her as unjust and distant, Margaret was genuine, compassionate, and driven by a strong sense of justice. Over time, David became not just a protector but also a trusted confidant and supporter. One day, Margaret had to travel to another city for an important meeting. David and his team meticulously prepared to ensure her safety at the hotel where she would be staying. As always, David carried out a thorough check of her room, but this time, his instincts picked up on something unusual. One of the security guards on his team was acting suspiciously, appearing nervous, frequently glancing at the heaters and avoiding eye contact. David quickly assessed the situation. He created an excuse to send the guard out of the room and, with Margaret's permission, inspected the area where the man had been behaving strangely. Beneath one of the heaters, David discovered a small voice recording device. This discovery shed light on a long-standing issue Margaret had been facing. For some time, confidential information about Margaret had been leaking to the media, but the source had remained elusive. Thanks to David's vigilance and decisive action, the problem was finally exposed. An investigation into the recording device revealed the trail of insiders responsible for the leaks. This incident became a turning point in Margaret's career. She was able to stand strong against those attempting to tarnish her reputation and emerge more resilient. With David's unwavering loyalty and support, Margaret took bolder steps in her political journey. For David, this new world had been an unexpected turn, but he had found his place in it. As long as Margaret continued her work, David was determined to stay by her side as her loyal security chief. He was no longer just a bodyguard, he was one of the most trusted people in Margaret's life. This new chapter became a success story for both David and Margaret, a testament to trust, determination, and resilience. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and leave a comment for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one.